This episode is brought to you by HP. Whenever you do your best thinking, the HP Spectre X360 is ready when inspiration strikes. With power save for battery life and focus mode to multitask, you can do your best thinking whenever and wherever it happens. The HP Spectre X360 2-in-1 convertible PC with Windows 10 saves battery life for whenever an idea hits you. HP Spectre X360, a more thoughtful laptop.
Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hi, and welcome to the Ideas Roadshow podcast. I'm Howard Burton, your host and creator of Ideas Roadshow, and I'm delighted to be partnering with the New Books Network to offer you our uniquely eclectic blend of long-format conversations with a wide array of experts across many different subjects. The following discussion is a reformatted podcast version of one of Ideas Roadshow's first 100 film conversations that's also available in video and print formats. Visit ideasroadshow.com for more details. The so-called mystery of Stradivari has long confused me. How is it possible, I wondered, that with all our modern scientific understanding and technological sophistication, we can't seem to find a way to make better violins than some guy who was born before the midpoint of the 17th century? Well, suffice it to say that I'm not the only person who's been perplexed by this. Joseph Curtin, award-winning violin maker and acoustician, has been trying to penetrate the secret of Stradivari for years. So much so that he and his colleagues developed a series of rigorous, innovative, and highly revealing experiments in an attempt to finally determine what exactly is going on once and for all. So what's the secret? Well, stay tuned. You're from Toronto, actually.
I am from Toronto, born in Toronto.
Right.
Raised there till I was 10, then we moved to England.
You can't really be from Toronto if you say Toronto.
Toronto.
Right. I mean, there's a credibility gap right there, I think.
Toronto. Do I say Toronto?
You just did. You said Toronto. I'm sure of it. I mean, we have it on film.
There we go.
No.
Okay, interview over. He's a fraud.
So I'm sorry. You were until you were 10. You said.
Yes. Then my family moved to England till I was about for 5 years, and then we came back to Canada.
Right. So I read that. But where in England were you?
London.
Oh, you were in London.
North London, Finchley.
Oh, really?
Do you know London?
Yeah.
Okay. Went to English Catholic grammar school, which was a low point in my...
Wow. But you survived that.
Yeah, and I actually took up violin there, so I'm ever grateful for that.
Right. So that leads on to my the big question, which is how does one actually become a luthier? How does that happen? And my understanding is, in your case, it happened, at least according to you, in a somewhat different way than it happens to most. But maybe there is no general.
I think, well, generally speaking, I'd say it would be circuitously. It's not a kind of a career track that your college counselor is going to give you or your high school counselor. I would have never dreamed, when I was a boy, that I ended up playing the violin. Music didn't really cross my mind. Nor would I have dreamed that trying to be a violinist would ever end up as a violin maker. But one gets exposed to these worlds, and you start to see they're interesting. I fell in love with violin playing. But I started rather late, and I didn't have good teaching, so it ended up being very frustrating. And
so this was at that school you said that you started.
That's where I started. Then we moved back to Canada. I played in the high school orchestra. We didn't get private instruction. Went to university and started getting private lessons, and of course I improved, but then I was told to quit by a famous violinist, and that was
Really? Who told? Are you allowed to say?
Laurent Fenivesh, who was one of the best violinists in Canada, the most sought-after teachers anyway. A devastating experience.
Told you to quit? That's pretty harsh.
Yeah, he invited me to his master class in Banff.
He invited you and then told you to quit?
Yeah, it's particularly painful.
Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, I could see his point, though. I mean, he sees this 19-year-old who's obviously loves it, but is technically ill-equipped. And I went into kind of part-time philosophy, music, and was really struggling. It was really very difficult to be told you can't do the one thing that you want to do. But then I kept taking violin lessons. One summer I'd been working as a busboy all summer, and I thought, I'll buy a violin. And I went and trying to get a better violin. That's when I got the name of Otto Erdős, who's a new violin maker in Toronto then,
right.
and his wife Rivka, who's an Israeli viola soloist. And I visited there and ended up staying for several years. She taught me viola.
Yeah, you switched to viola, right?
Yes, and then I kind of realized for myself that if you want to be a French poet, it's not enough to be poetic. You got to speak French. And that was the trouble with me and music. It's not internalized in a way. And now that I know many, top musicians and how their kids are brought up, it's a kind of it's a mother tongue almost. And I can't really carry a tune.
Is this something innate, you think, based upon your experience now, or is this something that would have been different had you had better teaching or different teaching at an earlier age, or had you started at an earlier age?
I think if I'd started at an earlier age, and I'd loved doing it, I would have progressed to whatever level I could have reached. I don't, and what they're learning more and more about the brain's plasticity is that you can do that at any age. Indeed, a couple of years ago, I got interested in practicing again and started taking lessons. But it was only because meeting Otto that I saw, oh, here's someone who's making their living at it. And I think I was interested, and he saw that, and he saw it in the kind of questions I asked and the things I noticed. I mean, how do you tell whether someone can do something if they're interested? So I think I would hang out with him and ask questions and notice things or not notice things. And after a particularly discouraging summer, I'd been playing chamber music and really feeling I'm not going to do this professionally. And really deciding I should ask Otto if he would teach me. The very day I was going to ask him, he just suggested to me. It was almost spooky, his timing. I guess he sensed that it was
right.
It would be a good path. And back then, I thought, violin making, who'd want to be stuck up in a room with a bunch of sawdust the rest of their life? It didn't seem romantic at all. But then once I started it, and it was, of course, completely in where violin playing seemed like this labyrinth, and I didn't quite know how to get through. I couldn't really tell how good I was. I couldn't really hear properly. Violin making, well, I can see, I can figure out.
It's a roadmap.
Yeah, I mean, it was just like an open door. I mean, it'd be really hard to learn it, but I didn't see any obstacle in the way, any impenetrable barrier. So I took to it, and Otto was very encouraging, and that made all the difference. And if I hadn't met him, I can't imagine quite what I would have done. A friend of mine told me when he was trying to figure out what to do, went to a career counseling service in Chicago where they give you batteries of tests for 3 days and figure out, and they thought he should be an engineer, and he'd never thought about that really. He'd talked about private detective and various things, and so he's now been an engineer for many years and still does a lot of other things. But what I remember him telling me was that they told him that if you have a gift in a particular area and a job in another area, you're not likely to be satisfied. I mean, you might have it as a hobby, but you want a career that overlaps the things that you're good at,
right,
or the things that you're interested in and are passionate about. And the amazing thing about violin making for me is, if I look back at my life, the things I've been truly passionate about is making things. Science, I always imagine I'd be an electrical engineer or something like that. So then music and art, the visual art. So really, all these playgrounds. Yeah. So I think of myself as someone who sort of flits between projects. I don't tend to finish things. I tend to keep coming back on them. And with violin making, if I get bored at the workbench, I can go up and do some acoustical measurements,
But you do finish the violins. I mean, if I'm going to commission a violin from you, it does get finished at some point, right?
Yes, that's been the saving thing about it. I pretty much work on commission, and I have to have it done, and that's that. But it's an excellent framework. It's an interesting concept. I think it's from the Myers-Briggs personality test. Remember, closer or finisher, they say, and I it's one of the ones I realized. Okay, I don't tend to finish things. Where my wife is an incredible finisher, and I think couples maybe
drawn together.
Yeah, I mean,
it's attracting and so forth.
Yeah, I think it balanced things out. People who finish things quickly maybe should have done some revising, and people who never finish things
right. Should have pushed
it certainly makes things easier for Christmas shopping. Just go in there, buy the damn thing, Joseph. But I've had violins back that were finished years ago, and for an adjustment, and I'll revarnish them. I mean, nothing ever feels done. And the same with writing. I tend to keep revising, but as long as there's deadlines where things officially go out in the world, I don't think of it as a bad quality. It just needs to be put under control.
So when you were being mentored by Otto, when he was showing you this, first of all, were you his first student, or had he been doing this sort of thing regularly? Do you have a sense as to?
I think he'd had apprentices back when he lived in New York. I don't know of any violin makers who taught. Who I don't know of anyone working in violin making who studied with him before I did. There may be. But there's a couple of other people. John Newton, a Canadian violin maker, was studying at the same time, and he's been a successful violin maker and is still working. Okay. But I'm sure, Otto certainly influenced my generation of Canadian violin making. That's not to say much. There's maybe half dozen of us, and just as Rivka made a big impact on viola playing in Toronto while she was there.
Okay. So you developed the skills. Mm-hmm. And then you want to go out in the world to make your living as a violin maker. Mm-hmm. And I could imagine, again, not knowing anything about this, I could imagine that's awfully difficult to get started, to bootstrap yourself. You're young, you have some skills, but you don't have a name by definition. You're just starting. Yes. How does that work? How do you get out there and start getting a name, start getting commissions, start being able to move forwards once you're brand new in the field?
I'll tell you what I now think of as a standard route. You study at a violin making school, and then you go to a restoration shop, and you apprentice there and learn to work with old instruments, and then you maybe set up on your own. Right. Or Otto was an informal person. I worked with him, and then remember I finished my first instrument at his place, and then for some reason it was really quite rude. I decided I needed to make my own entirely on my own, and I disappeared without calling and finished another instrument. It didn't occur to me that, boy, that's not an appropriate thing to do. But so I made my second one entirely on my own, and then I brought it back. And then after that, I would go back and forth a lot. And then what did I do? I worked in a pizza restaurant. I did all the usual things you need to do. You scrape by. I lived in a crummy apartment across from a lunatic asylum.
But to get a reputation, which you eventually got, did you get one big client to move forwards, or did you just starting making little inroads? Do you remember how that?
I sold a few around Toronto, but I got some contacts in New York somehow, and my girlfriend at the time was living in New York. She was a violinist, and that helped. And so actually, I started selling instruments in New York quite early on, and it got me through. I don't know, right. You sell a violin back then; it was for a few $1,000s. That could last a few months, so it wasn't bad. But I think my father co-signed a loan for me back then for $5,000, and I like to say I only paid it off last year. You keep building up a credit rating, I guess. But.
Right. But I mean, I'm just trying to get a sense of the market, not so much your personal. Obviously, you're young, you're struggling, you're doing what you can to get by. I get all that. But again, maybe I'm missing something. But for me, I have a sense of, okay, who's going to buy a custom-made violin? There are going to be people who are. If I'm just a normal music student, if I'm even a reasonably accomplished violinist, I'm thinking. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm probably not going to go buy a custom-made violin. This is my thinking. Maybe I'm completely off base here. So I'm thinking the market is probably not huge for people who are buying custom-made violins as opposed to going into a violin store and buying them. Is that right, or is that not right?
Well, there's two questions in there, really. There's the market for new violins versus old violins. And back when I was starting, I think my teacher Otto and a few other makers, an American maker called Sergio Perison, they were the first people really to be making their living as makers rather than makers repairers or makers and dealers in a great deal of time. So they kind of opened up this notion of selling new instruments to good players for a living. I didn't really get started until I'd met Greg Alf in Italy. We came back here in 1985, started Curtin and Alf, our company.
Right.
And then there were two minds, and we complemented each other rather well. He had some good market instincts. I had kind of anti-market instincts.
You didn't explode, did you? Did you get a market person and an anti-market person?
Right. But I remember the first time going on trying to sell a violin, going to my old university and showing it around, and a friend of my sister who was a player there said, "I didn't understand, was that actually for sale, that instrument?" And you sort of have a notion to point out everything wrong with it, so that they don't think you don't notice that. Right. So there's the whole psychology of presenting yourself in the world, and it takes a while to build up confidence. But Greg and I together could do more than either of us could do individually, and so we started a firm, and Ruggiero Ricci, a world-famous violinist, was living in Ann Arbor, and some of his students bought instruments, and he commissioned a copy of his Guarneri del Gesù.
Wow.
That was really a breakthrough. And then he let us use his photo as an advertisement, and we did these full-page ads in the Strad, which hasn't really been done much before then by makers. And then the phone started ringing, but it was pretty touch and go for a while.
So this idea, I wanted to move to this idea of the great 17th, 18th century violins. Mm-hmm. You've made some copies, as you said, and you've also done an awful lot of research from an acoustical perspective about this. And one of the reasons I was so keen to talk to you, as I mentioned earlier, is that not only are you an extremely well-established luthier, but you also have done a lot of research in acoustics, a lot of research in terms of seeking innovative products, new types of violins, new aspects, new sounds, what have you, new materials, and I'd like to get to that a little bit later on. Mm-hmm. But first, I want to go right to the cliche.
Okay.
This is something which I guess I've thought of. A lot of people have thought of, again, who certainly aren't expert. Here we have this notion of the ultimate violin, the Stradivarius, if you will, and somehow these guys in the 30s, 20s, were able, is that right? Am I got the right time period?
Absolutely.
We're able to produce these violins of unparalleled quality and unparalleled resonance and sound that hasn't been able to be duplicated since. So this is the claim, right? And this is in the public consciousness, this is the claim that this is somehow the apex. And in some bizarre way, notwithstanding all the modern technological advances that we have today, we haven't been able to replicate this sound, which strikes me as somebody who has a scientific background as just odd that we wouldn't be able to do that. And so what's that all about? Is that true? First of all, what do we know about? Is the claim true that this was absolutely the best possible type of violin at this time? It hasn't been able to be replicated since. And so again, excuse me for sinking into the cliche, but this is the hook that I certainly have when I think about these things as a complete non-specialist.
Yes, and that's very embedded in the culture, the secret of Stradivari.
Right.
And as soon as you start looking at that from a scientific point of view, or any serious point of view, what is the secret of Stradivari? It starts subdividing into many, many different questions. Now, is Stradivari the greatest violin maker who ever lived? I would probably say he was so far. The unknown genius is the person who made the first violin. It was probably Andrea Amati. And suddenly from nowhere comes this fully developed instrument. I mean, Strad didn't design it. Let's say Andrea Amati. I don't know where scholarship will end up. There's not a lot known. But out of his shop were coming fully formed instruments that didn't really change much.
When was that?
That was in the 1500s. Yeah. So by the time Stradivari was making them in the late 1600s, and Guarneri, his great contemporary, in the 1700s, it had already been going on for a couple hundred years. What they did is refine it and take it in a certain direction, and a direction that went along with the way music was developing, and a direction that provided more more of what players want, more power. They did things to the design. They lowered the arching, changed the number of physical parameters that I think made it an instrument that's more suitable for the emerging repertoire. Now, I'm not a person knowledgeable about violin making history, but I think what a lot of people don't realize is that if you were to take a violin straight from Stradivari's workshop with a bow from the time, most of the current repertoire would be unplayable, and it would probably be, inaudible. I mean,
really?
Yes, the Stradivari, any old instrument we know, is really a re-engineered object, and it's not just the restoration. I mean, which is an important part to fix all the cracks and everything else. It's a different instrument. The setup is so different. The bridge, the bass bar, a lot of them have been regraduated, made thinner.
Right.
And this has profound effects upon the sound, but that's completely ignored in the common notion. It's this sort of heroic idea of this instrument coming out mysteriously out of nowhere in the early 1500s and then brought to perfection by Stradivari and Guarneri, and then
gone into decline ever since.
Yes, but it's something I want to research more. Who actually started developing it? They started putting longer fingerboards because people wanted to go higher up. They put the neck in differently. Various people are figuring out exactly what was going on in terms of who did what when. But as far as I'm concerned, they're equally important contributions. They just don't have that kind of glamorous story to them.
Right. But
So
there's still the question of the sound, right? Again, from the man on the street, I say, well, there's this famous violinist. What kind of violin does he or she play? This world-class violinist. I mean, there are an awful lot of them that are playing Stradivarius, right?
Yes, and many
Guarneri and so forth.
fantastic players will say that old Italian sound is the best, and it's what we're all looking for.
But how do you characterize that scientifically? How do you characterize that old
This is
Italian
very,
sound?
very interesting. If you think of Stradivari as kind of almost a brand, it's instantly recognizable, it's highly esteemed. Stradivari, old violins, great sound.
Right.
Now, think about other kind of iconic, think of Tom Waits.
Right.
You can probably hear his voice, or think of your father's voice. You'll immediately recognize something. Frank Sinatra. Now think of the sound of a Stradivari. What comes to your mind?
Well, maybe I'm just not expert, but I just think of a violin. So.
Exactly. You'll hear. You probably hear a violinist. Well,
Right.
I mean, Itzhak Perlman, he plays a great Strad. So what you hear is maybe Heifetz or whoever your favorite player is in their sound, and they play a Strad or Guarneri, so that's their sound. But let's try and track it back a little bit. How much is the violinist and how much is the instrument? The question becomes, can the players tell the difference? And that was the kind of the radical thing with the blind listening test.
So tell me about those.
Well, I assumed that, like virtually everyone else, that there was an old sound and that came with age, and if it wasn't best exemplified by any particular maker, there's still a general quality there. And God knows the time we put into looking at old wood samples and trying to find differences. But researchers really couldn't find physical correlates with with these different instruments. And you look at response curves, sound radiation or admittance, and you see very similar sort of things. All of them are different. New, old, all violins look different, but they have similar features. And I say, we're not looking at the right thing or some different measurement, but the notion that, well, maybe there really isn't a difference. And what do we mean by is or isn't a difference? We're talking about something that can only be heard if it's played by a player. So if a player can't hear the difference or can't tell the difference, and the listeners can't, then you have to say there objectively is no difference. So that's testable.
So I want to get to that in just a second, but I mean, this very much resonates, as it were, with my confusion, because when I would hear these things, the stereotypical notion that there was this wonderful violin, the Stradivarius, and nobody could duplicate it, and there were types of violins, right? All of these Stradivarius, A, B, C, and D, and so forth. And this was the apex, this was the ultimate, this standard story, this cliche, as it was that you were saying. And I'm thinking to myself, but they must be able to figure out what the parameters are, what's actually going on. We have all this technology, we have all this testing. They must be able to say it was the type of wood, it was the type of resin, it was the type of this, it was the type of that. We should be able to identify if the sound quality can be parameterized in a clear way. We should be able to do that now. So what was very mysterious to me that we somehow weren't able to replicate it. And what you're saying before I'm going to throw it back to you, it seems to me, is that it's actually not that simple. We can't look at it that way in terms of these particular qualities are show up in this particular way, and it's attributable to this, that, or the other thing that can be duplicated. So anyway, it has to do with the person who's playing it, obviously, and it has to do with the conjunction of the two. Is that right? Or is
I remember once proposing to Gabi, this is Gabriel Weinreich,
who's a physicist.
Yeah, physicist, and one of the few really top physicists who went into violin research and musical acoustics. And so I was had this theory of maybe why this or that happened. And I remember he said, before you start making theories to explain a phenomenon, it's best to make sure the phenomenon actually exists.
Yeah, there you go.
And that's, you can look around forever for the secret of Stradivari, but unless you can define what you're looking for, you're not going to find anything. Now, the way to get objective data from subjective judgments, I mean, you can say, well, violin sounds subjective. How can you possibly? Well, you get a bunch of them and you start to find statistical trends. And the obvious way is with double-blind tests. The only way you can get rid of subjective biases, like if you know this is a Strad, then you're going to hold it different. You're going to treat it differently, and listeners are going to be changed by that knowledge.
So what happened? So tell me about the double-blind test. Tell me what the results were and how it was done and what the results were.
Well, this is where Claudia Fritz is a French researcher. I'd met her at Cambridge. We have a group of violin researchers. We meet there. And she was studying with Jim Woodhouse, a lead researcher, Cambridge professor, how we perceive violin sound and how we judge it. And she got interested in how people evaluate instruments. And she started doing some blind tests. And we invited her to the BSA Oberlin Acoustics Workshop, which is a week every summer in Oberlin that I co-direct with Fan Tao, who is also part of this. And so we said, well, come on over and let's do a blind test there. And there is, I don't know, something like 12 violins on a table, and various people there put on these goggles, and darkened room you play, and arrange them in order. And it's very interesting when suddenly a normal source of information is taken away. It's disorienting in a way. There's this curious mixture of, I don't know, uncertainty, but a kind of a freedom, just, the primacy of your perception, really listen. So it impressed me as that, yes, that was the way we should be doing this. That's how we can get at this difference between new and old, between Old Italian and non-Old Italian. So there's a big violin playing competition in Indianapolis, and Glenn Kwok, the director, is a very open-minded, interesting man, and that was an obvious place to do tests because a lot of good violinists there, and I got a lot of good violins. So I started organizing that, invited Claudia over and Fan, and it became a project, and we designed the experiment based on what we had learned at Oberlin and based on experiments Claudia had done in Montreal with people at McGill.
Right.
And
so how many people were involved?
There was 21 subjects. There was 3 new violins, 2 Strads, and a Guarneri del Gesù. So it's a small one. It was in a hotel room, and Claudia was 6 months pregnant, and it was just rounding up people after concerts. It was really just trying to pull something off.
Right.
But we did it well, I think, and it was so striking watching people. It's one thing reading about it. When you sit there and watch very good players pick up instruments, and which do you prefer, A, B, and seeing them starting to pick the new ones. They didn't know it, and they couldn't possibly know it. And I didn't even, you don't even know it being there because you don't see either, and then you start looking at, And how did it work if I'm playing the violin? How is it?
how is that knowledge screened for me that it's not this particular instrument? Does they all just happen to look? I mean, can't you
Violins
tell by looking in some way that what violin
by
is?
looking, absolutely, you can
So
see
they're playing it and they're not able to look at it. How does that work? Oh, they're wearing the goggles, right?
You get welder's goggles. You put some tape on them. You turn the light down till it's just a silhouette.
Right.
You really can't tell. We put a little bit of some sort of essential oil to mask scents.
So they couldn't tell. So the expert violinists couldn't tell by playing them. And what about when they were listening? And they were also the ones listening to others, right?
No, in that case, it was just players. It was just player preference,
okay.
that one.
Right.
So it's players in a hotel room, not completely blindfolded because that disorients you more profoundly.
Sure.
Claudia and their groups had found that. So just these goggles. Which do you prefer, A, B, A, B? And then that was one part. And then we got another part where they had 20 minutes to, kind of choose their favorite and sort of rank them. And then talk about the different qualities of each one. And a number of things were very clear listening, both Fan and I. Fan is an amateur violinist and has a good ear. We were both struck by the biggest difference was the violinist. I mean, remember a Russian violinist with a great bow arm cane? They all sounded like late Guarneri Dilge. I mean, that's kind of another one. They all sounded kind of bright and hyped up.
Huh.
And it was very impressive. There was so much the violinist. And the violinist had strong feelings about the difference between the violins. It wasn't as though these conditions took away the ability to discriminate. They discriminated very thoroughly. But the results were very interesting. There was a clear favorite. It happened to be new. There's a clear least favorite. It happened to be a Strad. In the middle, you'll have one violin. This person loves it. This person hates it. Most people hold it in qualified regard. This one particular Strad was considered both the easiest to play and the hardest to play by equal number of people. So clearly there's this middle group. If I wanted to measure those, and what am I going to measure to find out? What you need to do is take the ones at the extremes. Almost everyone likes this one, and almost no one likes this. Let's get 10 of each of those and start measuring. Then you'll start to find some.
Right. This gets back to the comment that Gavi made about you have to know what it is that the phenomenon actually is, what you're measuring, what you're looking for.
Exactly. And a lot of people have measured violins and even derived quality parameters, physical correlates with subjective judgments. But it was kind of assumed that violin quality is obvious. You just give it to a good player and ask him.
Right.
Or you listen. And you see this written. These were the ones of famous violinists, or these were judged. Or a researcher will say any violinist can tell in 30 seconds whether the violin is new or old. I mean, this is just sort of taken for granted. And I would have thought the same. It's not that they were far off, and they were, these were physicists more than.
Yeah, well, you know about those guys.
Well, but there's.
I was joking.
But there's an important point there. Physicists work in labs, and you don't get Strads just showing up in labs. So a lot of the work is done with these really violin-like objects. Very poor instruments. It doesn't matter if you're trying to work out the basic physics.
Right.
If you're trying to talk about quality, then you've got to start involving good players and good instruments. Now, unfortunately, I think there's been a general anti-science feeling in the violin-making world, in the music world even. The idea, I can't tell you how often I used to hear that there's a kind of a pride in the mystery of the violin, and that wouldn't it be a shame if...
You don't want to go there. You don't want to unravel. It's like a magician when you learn the tricks of it.
You don't want to... Well, why would you want to lose that mystery? Of course, that's not how it works. The more you understand, usually the more interesting.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank God. Or else
and the more you don't know, of course.
Yeah, exactly. It never stops. But there is I would say that violin makers weren't very interested in science. And there's a wonderful researcher, Norman Pickering. I remember him telling me once, I was about to go on and give a talk, acoustics lecture, and he said, Joe, there's a special silence that comes at the end of an acoustics lecture for violin makers. It's true. It just was out of the context, really.
Right.
And one could stay within this sort of region of working by intuition and everything, because it was well known that science couldn't explain it. So that was just kind
of... In
those
days, yeah.
Yeah. And how many times do you read media headlines? Favorite one of mine is sort of this golden voice of broadcasting comes in and says, for centuries, scientists have struggled in vain to understand the secrets of Stradivari. Really? In vain? Do you have an idea how many interesting things have been learned? It's like scientists have struggled for centuries to figure out the mysteries of the human brain. Well,
and they've made a lot of progress.
Yes, and it's still interesting and still a mystery. That's just how the world is. The notion that there is a simple secret that, if you'd say scientists have struggled in vain to discover the cure for cancer, well, okay, then you know what the answer would be. You can cure it or you can't.
But even still,
it's a lot more complicated.
We've made a lot of progress.
Yeah.
There are a lot of cancers that can be treated, of course, in more advanced ways.
Absolutely, and I know nothing about
well, neither one of us do. So we should keep talking about that.
But at least there's a clearly defined goal.
Right.
Like people won't die of cancer.
Right.
Whereas with the secret of Stradivari,
well, what are we talking about here?
Yeah. So so much I think energy was wasted just in looking for the wrong things. Now, back to the Indianapolis experiment got a lot of attention and a lot of criticism, very little by scientists actually, because the reviewers of the paper get most of the, you sort that out beforehand.
Right.
So, but it was, well, what can you tell in a hotel room? I mean, you can't tell anything in a hotel room.
Right, so that's distorting. So that's the big distorting effect that they're isolating. So
maybe. I mean, do soloists, do violinists play in hotel rooms? Well, all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, the better they are, probably the more they do because they live in them. But the point is a fair one. Projection, which is how well a violin can be heard at a distance, can't really be judged from under the ear. It can only be judged by a listener, and we didn't have listeners. But then we weren't claiming to...
Right. So this speaks to the need for more tests.
Yes, exactly. And so it was a small test that it provided kind of a counterexample to the kind of general, the received wisdom on
right.
And then, so the next one was a much bigger test, and we could learn from everything we had learned in Indianapolis, and that was organized in Paris by Claudia, and she got a grant through her lab to do it. And then,
so when was that? When did that happen?
That was in this past September,
right.
End of September. It was a week, and we thought we'll just use soloists. We don't want to be criticized for using, So we had 10 soloists. We had 6 new violins and 6 old violins, 5 of them Strads, and those were chosen out of a pool of about 10 or 12 significant old violins.
Right.
So we felt that, okay, those 3 instruments didn't happen to do as well. Well, let's try with these 6.
Right.
Nothing's conclusive, but
right.
The trouble with violins of this kind of quality, I mean, you have 100 million worth of instruments, and that's only a few.
Yeah.
You can really only learn, I think, by doing a lot of small tests. We'll never be able to do like a drug test where you can get
5,000
700. Yeah. I mean, 600 Strads in existence. I suppose it's conceivable you could get them all together, but
it's logically possible, but probably not much more than that. So what happened? So you did this test. What were the results?
Well, pretty much the same. We did it. We gave them more time. We had the soloists in a rehearsal room. It was that a family used for rehearsing all the time.
Okay. And the sound could project much more. You weren't.
Well, it was more like a normal room you'd practice in. It wasn't a hall, but they evaluated them. They had an hour with these 12 instruments, and they asked them to eliminate the ones they didn't think were suitable, which they can do pretty quickly, and then focus on. And so I think 7 out of 10 chose a new violin.
Two questions I wanted to ask. Were any of these new violins yours, just out of curiosity, in either one of these
No
tests?
one will ever know who made any of the new violins.
Oh, it's double blind, right.
And it's also set up not to be a marketing thing for any particular new maker.
Sure.
And so we'll stay away from that. They were all professionally made.
Okay.
And there is 6 different makers.
Okay.
Day one, I think 7 out of 10 chose new violins.
7 out of 10?
Yes.
Huh.
I think. But then the next day we did it in a hall, a beautiful small hall, but excellent acoustics. And we had a piano and we had a pianist. So they're still blindfolded, but they could play with the piano accompaniment. Mm-hmm. So they could hear how it felt with the piano, and they could have a trusted listener out in the hall to give him feedback or another soloist to play. So all the things a violinist would normally do, they did, except they didn't know what they were playing. And again,
didn't change anything, or what were the results there? With roughly the same?
Pretty much the same, yes.
Huh.
And then the next day, we had just a few violinists playing excerpts of solo violin, like A, B, A, B. So you could listen to two violins. And the question is projection. Which can you hear better? Which is clearest? And projection on their own and with an orchestra. We had a whole orchestra assembled, and they'd do these, choose some excerpts where the climaxes to different concertos where the violinist tends to be almost drowned out by the orchestra. New violin, old, new, old, and then audience of about 50 experienced listeners, violin makers, players, acousticians, checking off. It went on for an hour, 2 hours, and there was no doubt about it, the new instruments projected better. Huh. And old instruments tend to sound rather soft under the ear, but there's this notion that they project. Despite that, the sound seems to grow the further you get from them. And this is a commonly expressed thing, the mellow instrument that projects, and that is a mystery. But again, does it exist? They didn't. There was a particular Strad that was very well liked. I mean, it was chosen as favorite by, I think it was the third most preferred instrument. But it didn't project very well. It had a lot of energy at the low frequency. To project well, it seems you need to make a lot of sound and have a fair amount of it at high frequencies. Your ear is most sensitive about 3,800 hertz, 3.8 kilohertz, 2 to 4 is this kind of range where we pick up a lot of things. And if there's not much energy there in a hall, you're not going to hear it very well. And that's what seems to be the case here. So under your ear, on the other hand, the mellow sound can often be very enchanting and lovely to play. The violin that did best there was, I'm surprised so many people liked it under the ear because it was quite loud and almost to the point of irritating.
Well, so that would go against this whole phenomenon, though. Wouldn't it go against the enchanting mellow sound? Presumably that's not even... that phenomenon doesn't necessarily exist then, at some level.
There's no doubt that there's loudness under the ear varies from instrument to instrument. And I would think a caricature of new violins would be bright and loud under the ear, kind of crass. And a caricature of old ones would be this very mellow, smooth. It's not a caricature, it's a portrait. And but there's actually some old instruments that are very bright and very loud under the ear. So I don't think...
Sure, because I'm thinking if the signal was that distinct, if that correlation was that strong, then the people playing would be able to tell, presumably, right? They'd be able to. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yes.
I mean, they should be able to tell this. Oh no, this is the mellow guy. And so I must be playing a Stradivarius or something like that.
Well, this is what surprised me. That at least for soloists, they seem to go for big sounding instruments. And I did acoustical measurements of all the instruments, where I was measuring the sound output all around the instrument. We can talk about how later on, but it's the sound radiation per unit force at the bridge. And there was a definite correlation. The ones that the soloists preferred put out more sound, right across the board. And if you take a graph of the two most preferred, it's about 3 dB above the graph of the two least preferred. And this really hadn't been isolated before, and the reason not is because you didn't have that selection process. Because there's a lot of violins that are just right in the middle, and they blur it. Right. So
this is going to be a big deal, presumably, when it comes out. I mean, this is going to make some waves, I would think.
I think so, yes. Now, what's interesting, okay, so we also had the players, unbeknownst to the audience, play an excerpt of a concerto on their own instruments, and half of them are new and half of them are old.
Right.
And then we asked the audience simply to listen to this 30 seconds of concerto and guess, is it new or old?
Right.
People believed the first two that were played, people had strongly believe one way or the other. In both cases, it was wrong. They thought, and then the rest was completely random. So.
I'm sorry, but I mean, these are. Yeah. So here I am, a complete non-expert, and it's great when I see these kinds of empirical results. Because
and also in day 2, after the soloists have been playing in the hall, we presented each player with a series of instruments, like their most preferred, their least preferred. They didn't know what, and just asked 30 seconds, new or old, completely random, completely random. And people would say things like, this is the maybe 19th century. It was this. They were hearing something. Okay, so let's say that our findings show. It doesn't mean that there aren't any differences, but let's say our findings showed that neither the player nor the listener can tell old from new, which they seem to. It doesn't mean there isn't a difference, and there clearly is a difference, because if they simply had said old for all the violins they couldn't hear as well, they would have got it almost right. That's the crazy thing. There are differences, but that's not what people were listening for. The thought was old instruments project better, or old instruments do this, old instruments do that.
So the subjective nature that we impose, these ideas that are actually quite distinct from what the reality is. As you said, if they had just looked at the projection, then they would have been able to distinguish between the two of them. But they're bringing a different perspective when they play or when they listen.
When we hear something, when I play a violin now, even knowing everything I know, it's really hard to subtract the impressions. If I pick up an old violin, I mean, they're beautiful. I love them. And I put on a mirror. I have to remind myself what I'm hearing is what hits my eardrum, and it's also everything I know and love about old instruments. When I play my own instrument, it's what hits my eardrum and my own self-doubts and worries, and all these color one sound, and all of which makes it important to start measuring sound. The kind of image I use now is that, pilots, when they're flying, if the weather gets bad, don't trust your instincts.
Right.
Trust the measurements.
Right.
Yeah, because the two, in an ideal world, they work together. And right now, violin makers are used to measuring things, but not sound. I mean, the equipment hasn't been available, and it's,
so that's a great segue to get to that. But right before we do, if I may, we haven't talked about the bow.
Yeah, before we get to there, let me just talk about the finish of the experiment.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
The measurements. There was a general difference between the old ones and the new ones, not just in the amount of power, but those differences, I think, are characteristic of slightly thinner instruments, which is exactly what's true with old ones. They've got thinned out a bit in general, I think you can say. And most new makers wouldn't go quite as thin as that.
So what are we talking about? We're just talking about the thickness of the material, the thickness of the wood?
The top and back, especially the setup. As you thin things out, the frequency of the resonance go down. You get a slightly darker sound. Okay. This is a generalization, but there's a trend there. And this is something that'll take a lot more study. But looking at the characteristic curves of the old and the new, in those 12 instruments, there was a general difference. I think it could be explained by a difference in average thickness. You don't have to go to properties of old wood or anything elaborate like that.
Right.
So that's what we know so far, or found so far. It was done again in New York with a smaller blind test, again doing projection, and again pretty much the same thing.
The same results.
The audience couldn't tell, and the old didn't project as well.
So to sum up, if I may, I got to try. So correct me if I'm wrong. To sum up, a couple of interesting results come out of this. One is neither the players nor the listeners can actually distinguish between or show any marked preference for old instruments and new instruments. In fact, they do show a marked preference for the new instruments. Sorry, yes. They prefer the new instruments, and they can't tell whether an instrument is necessarily old or new when they're doing this.
Absolutely.
But there are empirical data. My subject-verb agreement. Anyway, we know that there are differences, measurable differences between old instruments and new instruments in terms of the quality of the sound. There is a way of actually measuring some of this, but we're not sure exactly let me back up. But we're not sure exactly what produces that, although you have your suspicions. But also the people who are, even though there are these differences that are objective, that are out there, the people who are listening or the people who are playing aren't necessarily making that correlation with those differences. They have a whole different mental toolkit when they come down to play in terms of what they desire and what they don't, which depends on all sorts of other factors.
And this comes to actually something that I'm greatly interested in now, which is learning to hear the violin, learning to describe what we're hearing in objective terms rather than subjective ones. One of the difficulties with working with players, violin makers working with players, is they'll come and say, I'd like it a little darker, a little brighter, a little warmer, a little woofier, a little goosier, who knows, you know. And you've got to figure out, some of them are clearer enough, others not. A little brighter, a little darker is pretty clear. What would happen if we just described the objective characteristics of sound? Well, you can't do that unless you can hear it clearly. Musicians are, and a lot of them have incredible ears, and you can play a bunch of chords that they can tell you what notes are playing. I mean, they're used to hearing analytically, but more in musical terms. In other words, the notes that make up a chord or the musical structures. There's no reason we can't learn to hear timbre in those same terms. Recording engineers do it all the time.
Right.
And they train by, having equalizers that, there's software for training where, it's down 3dB at, 2 kilohertz, that third octave band. Can you hear the difference? I mean, the random changes you've got to identify. You can gradually train your ear to hear differences and explain those differences. Well, there's a bit of a boost at 3 kilohertz.
Is there a danger, you think, or do people feel that there might be a danger that if they train or retrain their ears to hear in this particular way, that it will somehow interfere with their musicality? That will somehow be too clinical, too scientific, too detached? They'll start thinking in a way which doesn't make them susceptible to be able to play music at the highest possible levels? Have you heard those sorts of arguments, or are you cognizant of those sorts of fears?
Well, right now ear training for violin sound doesn't exist, so it hasn't come up there, except I've been thinking about it and giving the occasional talk about it. I can't imagine why anyone would feel that way. Musicians are incredibly pragmatic people. If anyone who spends hours playing scales, does that enhance your musicality? No.
Sure, no, I guess
precision and all the rest of it.
I'm trying to imagine that the people, we talked a little bit earlier about this sense of, well, you don't want to be too technical or too scientific because that will somehow give away the mystery, and we should keep the mystery.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm trying to project something, an argument, which may be completely inexistent, but I'm trying to project an argument that people might actually use, that, oh yes, well, this is all very clinical and scientific, but somehow that would interfere with, that would give away the mystery or something. But anyway, you haven't heard any
not yet. I'm sure it'll come up. There's always a reason not to do something. I think it'll simply clarify things. I mean, it'll mean we can have but the thing is, their recording engineers are doing it all the time.
Right.
I mean, they just don't even talk about it. They just do the adjustments. It's just usually becoming better acquainted with reality and identifying it more clearly is invigorating. I think yes, it's not.
Okay, so let's get to some of your techniques to be able to analyze and hear the sound a little bit better. And you've developed some of them yourself, and presumably there are other people who've
yes, I've sort of had a ongoing project, ways of measuring violin sound in a workshop setting rather than in a laboratory. So I've taken techniques developed by others and adapted them and refined them for violins, for violin making use. A couple of things I find as a working maker, if you can't measure something in 10, 15 minutes, you're not going to do it.
Right.
In a lab, my definition of boredom is watching a physics experiment in progress. I mean, setting up all day and fixing software and getting connections, and then boom, and it's over. That's not going to work for violin makers.
Right.
So let's take what they're doing in a lab. Well, in a lab, I mean, there's a saying, I think, that equipment's over-designed if you can use it more than once. You just want to design something for that experiment and then, move on. Okay. I wanted something that would evolve into a tool which you could use again and again to measure violins in a standardized way.
Sure.
So it would be a workshop tool, a measurement tool, rather than a physics tool, although hopefully it could be used for both. A German violin maker researcher called Martin Schleske started using what's called an impulse hammer, an impact hammer. It's a tiny little hammer with a force sensor in its head, and it's a widely used engineering tool. You can whack a bridge with one of those and it'll measure the force, and you put accelerometers all over the bridge. You can see what the motion's like, and you can study the normal modes of a bridge. Now, I think in the 70s, some very small ones started coming out, which were feasible for tapping violins or tapping violin bridges. And Martin Schleske, who I got to know quite well and admired very much, had it set up where the violin was held upright. You'd tap the bridge and you'd rotate the violin with respect to a microphone so you could measure the sound all around it. Now, the thing about violin compared with, let's say, a loudspeaker is that it's very directional with frequency. Above about 800 hertz, it starts getting more and more directional out the front of the instrument. And at higher frequency, you get these kind of quills of sound in different directions, and they move, with each semitone. And Gabriel Weindreich was one of the people who formulated that as directional tone color. That's part of what we hear as violin sound, how it fills space. It's a very particular quality. And he invented a speaker that would reproduce that effect. And it's exactly the effects that's lost certainly by a single loudspeaker, because
they all combine it together.
The art of loudspeaker making is to make something that's as omnidirectional as possible, and as flat as possible, at least in the directions that can't be omnidirectional. So it's not a natural thing to get through a speaker, and most people have only heard violins through speakers. I mean, not much of the world has really been to a concert.
I had no understanding of that at all. I mean, that alone, just to interject for it, is shocking to me. The idea that the sound fills space in a very different way when you're in a live concert. And of course, it makes sense now that I hear you, but that's.
And there's been a tremendous amount of research into that lately. How to recreate, the musical impressions we have in a concert hall, or recreate ones that are satisfying. What we love, what we don't love. Surround sound, I mean, there's fill in some spatial information that's lost in stereo and that the ear seems to love. At any rate, for me it was really a standardized way of measuring the radiated sound of an instrument, so that I could put in an instrument, put in another one, and be measuring the same thing, fold that up, take it somewhere else, and again measure the same thing. One of the problems, of course, is the room. You get room reflections. But I do it with the microphone quite close up, and it ignores a lot of what's going on in the room. I use a directional microphone. All these things are compromises. I mean, you lose some view of the instrument no matter what choice you make, but
it does make it transposable. You can take it here and there.
Yes, and so the last time in New York, by chance, we could do the measurements in an anechoic chamber.
Cool.
Which was just great.
Yeah.
But I came back and measured one violin in the anechoic chamber, and then right over there, and they're very close. I mean, there's some differences, but kind of the expected.
So you don't have to be in an anechoic chamber, which is useful.
Right. That was very helpful to know. So you were going to ask about the bow, I think?
Oh, I did, but let's get to that at the because I wanted to actually. Well, I don't know if we can move over because we're in the middle of this shoot here. But if you can, maybe. Well, how are we going to do this? Can we? Do
you want to come back to here?
Yeah. Maybe.
Finish here and then.
Yeah, maybe we can do that. Maybe we can finish
sure.
and then go over, because I do actually want to take a look at this thing and have you describe it in terms of how it works and the hammer and so forth when we're actually looking at it. Because I think that would be useful, since we do have this video product. We might as well have pictures of what's actually going on.
Absolutely.
But so what I'm getting from you is an interesting, what I would call progressive, not to be overly sycophantic, but progressive marriage of aesthetics, which I know you believe in very, very strongly and you care about deeply. The love of the musical experience, but also the full embracement of science to be able to not only determine objectively what the issue is and what we're talking about, but also how we can innovate and how we can improve upon the quality and experience of the products that we have. So one is just simply detection, right? Finding out exactly what the sound is and get a sense of that, because again, as you were saying, unless we have a clear understanding of what's going on, we can't hope to do anything more progressive. But you've also experimented with very light violins, you've experimented with digital violins and so forth. So what was your motivation in doing these things? And what have you done? Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, like all violin makers, I started out essentially copying, whether I thought of it as that way or not, but then explicitly copying old violins, trying to look ever more closely at what's going on. After a while, in the mid-90s, I think, after maybe working for 15 years, you start to feel the image I use is a Civil War reenactor doing battles that were lost or won a long time ago. Why keep refighting them? Why do I try and make something that looks old, that looks like I made 2 centuries ago, when everyone else in the universe is
moving on? Yes,
and well, there's this, but there's this special something that you haven't recaptured yet.
Right.
But then again, there's a special something about Michelangelo that people haven't captured again, but
they're not even trying.
Yeah, and for good reason. So there's just kind of a restlessness. I get bored quickly, I guess, but also I don't live in the aesthetic world of the 1700s, 1800s. When I go to art galleries, I love contemporary art, I love modern art. So there's a real dissonance there. So I started asking myself questions. Well, could I make something beautiful that doesn't look just like a Strad or a Guarneri, and then how much of that can overlay with what musicians would agree to play on. I mean, this is a fairly conservative world. I mean, you wear black and white, and you go in there with your brown or orange violin, and you kind of fit into an orchestra. If you want to make a living, you've got to pretty much conform to that sort of thing.
At least until you get to be at such an incredibly high level that presumably you can do whatever you want. But that probably takes a long time to.
Maybe I haven't reached.
No, but I mean I'm not talking about the violin maker so much. But I mean, presumably, if you are Itzhak Perlman or something like that, then you could show up with a bright pink violin if you felt like doing so without threatening your career, I would guess.
Well, I tend to think now that there are opportunities for players to differentiate themselves by doing something new. So much of classical music is fundamentally, it's kind of a museum curating. I mean, the Beethoven concerto, the Mozart, which are absolutely life-changingly beautiful works. But after you've had generations of violinists doing them, you start to wonder, well, for a soloist, I think, well, how can I differentiate myself? And with the incredible high levels of violin playing now, sooner or later, I would think players might find an advantage in having something distinctly different, especially if you were a quartet, where you're a kind of a complete aesthetic unit. You don't have to fit with an orchestra. You don't have to. But that's neither here nor there. I've come to think of the best direction for innovation is actually to solve problems rather than express aesthetic feelings, but just try and solve problems with the traditional design.
So what kind of problems are you trying to solve? What are you?
Well, the violin is so often thought of as a perfect design, but really if you look closely, it's riddled with unresolved design issues. And if I grab a violin,
a prop. We finally move into the prop mode.
So here's a violin. Looks just like an old one, but it's not. The corners. I mean, we makers spend hours getting the corners. There's whole lectures about how that point is drawn in Strad and Guarneri violins.
Yeah. So why are they there anyway?
Well, they're for aesthetic reasons. Right. Yeah. But you give it to the player, they knock it off, you stick it on. They knock it off, you stick it on. At what point is it like a 5 mile per hour 5-mile-per-hour bumper. You don't want, a fin sticking out in a vulnerable place.
Right.
Maybe they shouldn't be there with this. This is a digital violin, but it came from a simplified design science doing. It's less obtrusive. It still looks kind of like a violin. Do you like it? Yes, no, whatever. But it's a proposed solution to what I think of as a design problem.
Right.
But that's the least of it. Violins get damaged, and they get damaged in particular ways. And there's no reason we can't design them to resist that damage.
So tell me a little bit about that. Tell me the ways in which they get damaged and the ways that you might design them to resist.
Well, there's a post in there called the sound post, and it's pressed between the two of them, and it tends to dig a hole in the top, and there tends to be a crack that happen there. So years ago, I started putting a little veneer of hardwood in there, and that completely stops it happening. Doesn't affect the sound.
It doesn't affect it at all, eh?
Yeah, and then I started doing the same thing on the other side. The bridge is pressing down with about 20 pounds of force from the strings on this fragile wood, and it gradually works a hole in there. And old violins have big dents there and usually cracks around there. I've started putting these little veneers underneath the bridge glued to the instrument that stop that happening. Now, this is a very mild innovation, and they raise some eyebrows. People say, what's that there? And, well, how does it affect the sound? Well, really, it doesn't affect the sound?
Right.
And so simple things like that, I think, are relatively easy to do, although it took me a lot of time to feel comfortable doing it because, we're not...
Because of the conservatism in the...
Yeah, it's an ingrained conservative. I think it's really the violin makers who are conservative, and the musicians pick it up from us. It's this sort of this loop between, well, violin makers, we worship the old ones, and they, it's...
Right.
And the pegs are another. I mean, these are just friction-fitted wooden pegs, and they work pretty well if they're adjusted well, but, the weather changes, and
right.
There's no reason we shouldn't have
I've thought about
mechanical pegs. And there's some quite good ones coming out now, I mean, where planetary gears inside, so they give you a better ratio. To my mind, no one's got it right yet. They're either too heavy or you have to glue them in. Why do we have a scroll here? It looks nice, but we could have...
Why do you have a scroll?
It's just traditional. It has no acoustical effect. You could have an angel's head, a devil's head, Obama's head, whatever you like. But then it gets... that's just an aesthetic thing. And this one has a single turn design of mine. It's a little different. I mean, it's not radical, and it works on its own terms, I think. But the more profound innovations, or what I think of as, are the ones that you're trying to do something specific with the sound, and then you have to say, why would you want to do that? Do players like it?
So what kind would those be?
Well, the first time I had the top of a Stradivari, Greg Alf and I, was when we had to copy, and we had to put a new bass bar. The client wanted one. Took the top off, and I weighed it, and it was... People weren't used to weighing violin tops. They measure everything else about violins, but not the weight of the tops and backs for some reason. And you can find books on how the purfling's inlaid and what materials, but back in 1985, 86, you really didn't know what the weight of a top and back should be or why you should measure it. Carlene Hutchins, a researcher, said I should get a scale, and I did start measuring. So I weighed the Strad, and it was like 54 grams. And boy, I weighed mine, it was 80 grams. This isn't a subtle difference.
Yeah.
And that got me thinking, well, what is the effect of the mass? And of course, you step back a minute, it's